Hugh White, thank you very much for your time. Paul Keating says Australia's independence on foreign policy has weakened, that we've surrendered our objectives to the US at the expense of relations with our Asian neighbours. Do you agree with him on that?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of justice in that criticism. I think at the moment Australia is facing some immensely significant changes in our strategic situation, and that really do require us to rethink some of the fundamentals of our foreign policy. And I think we've been far too eager, content to go along with the way the United States is approaching, particularly the key issue of the rise of China, and haven't thought hard enough about what kind of role we want America to play in Asia, what kind of role in Asia for America would best suit our interests, and what we can do to try and encourage the United States in that direction. I think very big Australian interests are at stake in that, and I think it's a big failure on our part not to really focus on that much harder than we have.
Professor White, on the US alliance, isn't it true, though, that the world view of the Rudd-Gillard government isn't that different to the Obama administration, so you would expect some or a fair degree of policy alignment as well?
Well, I think when you look at Australia's perspective on the whole question of America's role in Asia, clearly we want the United States to stay engaged, and clearly the United States wants to stay engaged. But from Australia's point of view, we desperately need the US to stay engaged in a way which doesn't generate rivalry with China, because as Australia's political leaders keep saying, we don't want to make a choice between the US and China. Now the problem is that the US approach to China does help to drive rivalry between them and Beijing. And it's not all America's fault. Beijing is playing its part as well, but both of them are building up the relationship towards the kind of confrontation which would be a disaster for Australia. And Australia is supporting the United States in an approach to China which makes that kind of rivalry and confrontation more serious. That's why I think Australian political leaders have got to go to their American counterparts and say, look, we want you to play a strong role in Asia, but we want you to reconsider the shape of that role to reduce the risk that the US-China relationship ends up being one of confrontation, let alone conflict. And I don't think that's a message that Australian political leaders have conveyed to America at all clearly. And I think, in fact, many of the things we've done, including the Marines in Darwin, have tended to push the other way, tended to tell the United States we support them in taking the kind of, I think, very tough line against China that they've been taking.
So what do you think needs to be done to improve the dialogue, to minimise the risk of that tension increasing? Does there just need to be more transparency? What do you envisage as actually putting both of those relationships on a more sustainable footing for the future?
Yeah, look, it's a really critical question. I think the first thing to do is to recognise that whilst the United States can, and I think should and must, continue to play a very significant role in Asia, it can't continue to play the same role as it's played in the past, because the role it's played in the past, that of uncontested leadership, worked while China was poor and weak. But now that China is rich and strong, I think it's inevitable that China is going to have to be given a bigger share of regional leadership. That means the United States is going to have to be prepared to share power with China to a significant degree. Now, that's something which Americans find very hard to comprehend. It's also worth saying that the Chinese will have to be willing to agree that America continues to play a big role in Asia, and that's something which I think the Chinese in the end might find a bit hard to accept. So both the US and China are going to have to accept that they're going to have to work with the other. But for Australia, I think the key thing is for us as an ally of the United States to convey to the United States the idea that we want them to stay engaged and play a big role, but not to do it in a way that refuses to accommodate China's ambition for greater power, that just tells China they've got to stay in the kind of subordinate position that they've accepted for the last 4 decades. And that I think it's just a matter of pure diplomacy. That's an argument we've got to make to the United States. It's an issue we've got to debate with our friends in the region, countries like Indonesia and Singapore and Japan and Korea, other countries that have a big interest in this. And of course it's something we need to talk about to China. Whereas at the moment, I think what the government's doing is just pretending none of this is happening. They're pretending that the US-China relationship is in great shape. That's what the Asian Century White Paper released a couple of weeks ago said. And I think that's just way too complacent.
Professor White, we've seen some big moments on the world stage, the US election, continuity on that front with President Obama staying in the White House. A big moment today as well, the new leadership unveiled in China, Xi Jinping, as expected, becoming the new head of the Communist Party. Tell me, how do you see this playing out? Many expect that the rising China will see a more assertive China as well in terms of its foreign policy. But with this new framework, the new leadership, how do you see it playing out?
Well, I think, the first point to make, Kieran, is that we should all be, in a sense, pleased that the Chinese leadership transition process has gone through smoothly. There were some questions earlier in the year as to whether the wheels might not fall off that process. It's very important to all of us that China's political system should continue to function in a stable fashion, and I think we should be reassured by that. I think the new leadership is likely to have many of the characteristics of the old, particularly in terms of its relationship with America. Obviously, nobody in China is dumb enough to want to find themselves in an armed confrontation with the United States. On the other hand, they are, I think, determined, as their predecessors were, that as China's power grows, it plays a bigger role in regional affairs. It's given more of a leadership role. And so I think what we'll see from Beijing, from the new leadership, is a combination of caution but also ambition. They'll keep pushing the envelope as their predecessors have been doing. And that does carry risks. I think we've seen, for example, in the confrontations in the South China Sea, in the Senkakus with Japan, the kind of situations emerge which could very easily generate, perhaps accidentally, a small-scale crisis which escalates into a large-scale conflict and which could really end up having devastating consequences. So I think it's going to be very important both for China as it pushes its ambitions and for the United States as it tries to defend its old position, to be extremely careful about the way that evolves. But I don't think we can manage that simply by saying to China, no, you've got to stay in your box. No, you can't have a bigger role in Asia than you had when your economy was 1/20th the size of the United States, now that your economy is just about as big as America's. I think that's just unrealistic.
And one final question, if I can. Mr. Keating, the former Prime Minister, says that Australia should be a member of ASEAN, that we need to focus more on Southeast Asia. Do you see that there is more scope for Australia to increase its strategic footprint in Southeast Asia? What more could and should be done?
Look, I certainly do. I think that the emphasis that Keating made in that speech on the significance of our relationships in Southeast Asia, and especially his emphasis on Indonesia, is really critical. I think one of the problems that Australia has at the moment in the way we see the world is we don't understand just how big and important Indonesia is becoming. Within a couple of decades, and the decades go past pretty fast, Indonesia will have an economy which is not just bigger than ours, but much bigger than ours. We think still of Indonesia as a poor, weak country, and that's not true anymore. It's increasingly a strong and wealthy country, and it's going to play a very big part, much bigger part than it has in the past, in shaping Australia's international environment. I think Keating said in his speech that Indonesia is where our strategic bread is buttered, and it's a characteristically colourful Keating phrase, but I think there's a lot of truth in it. And at the moment, the way we think of our relationship with Indonesia is just as a matter of sort of the retail diplomacy of managing individual problems like, live cattle exports or people smuggling or terrorism. Whereas I think what Keating's saying is we need to step back and ask, what kind of relationship do we want with this very big and potentially very powerful country right next door to us 20 or 30 years from now? And if we want that kind of relationship, then we have to start doing things now to build towards that, because these things can't be done in a day.
Professor Hugh White from the ANU, I appreciate you exploring some of these very important issues with us today. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.